The election season must now transition into a time of governance, and newly elected officials with views across the political spectrum will be tasked to find common ground to improve the welfare of the country and the state. Joining me in the studio to reflect on the election season and to look into the future of governing is Dr. Larry Jacobs of the University of Minnesota's Humphrey Institute. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Now that the campaign is over, is it going to be difficult for those newly elected and re-elected officials to make the transition from the campaign trail and the rhetoric of the campaign trail to policy making and governing?
Yes. Next question.
Can you elaborate?
Yeah. No, I think it's very difficult. We've got a political system now that is quite tribal. Mm-hmm. We've got the Hatfields on one side and McCoys on the other side, and you know, it's not just they disagree on policy or one thinks taxes should be this much more and or that much lower. It's really a fundamentally different set of visions or understanding or definitions of what is good policy. And so I think, what is the common good? There's not one accepted view of that. That, you know, you could start off by saying there's two, but there are also divisions within each party. You know, for instance, in Minnesota, I think there's a very stark difference between the legislators in the metro area and the legislators from greater Minnesota. Mm-hmm. And I think that divide, you know, for instance, splits the Democratic Party. You know, not quite as much as the partisan divide, but it's very profound, and it leads to different views about transportation, about a whole host of issues.
Light rail or busing, yeah. So back in May, you gave a talk, I think it was down in Northfield, where you said that Trump is not unelectable. You were raising that as, you know, this is an impossibility. What did you see that others didn't?
Well, I gave that talk, and then I was asked to write a piece for the Star Tribune, which I did. And I laid out a series of developments and themes that were apparent to me in the spring. And most of them have come into, you know, really played themselves out. One was the fact that even though Donald Trump had policy views and behaved in a certain way that voters might find you know, an unfavorable way, mm-hmm. they were drawn to him because he was articulating this deep distrust in government. He was talking about the rigging of a system which many Minnesotans and Americans thought were favoring a few special interests over the general good of the country. Mm-hmm. And then we also saw this deep partisan divide. And this was at a time when many commentators were talking about how Republicans were going to abandon the Republican Party. And this is not the way politics are organized today. Mm-hmm. We are really tribal. We've got the Hatfields and McCoys, and the idea that the McCoys were not going to rally around you know, one of their kinfolk, just it's not realistic. And then I also, you know, I talked about the ways in which Donald Trump had kind of rallied different factions. Mm-hmm. And we did talk about the advantage that Hillary Clinton had among women, but was really striking to me how little attention was given to the gaps that Donald Trump had created, gaps among advantages among men, among whites, among voters who did not have a college education, among Americans who lived in rural areas. I mean, these were all large gaps, and it still amazes me that up through the election, there was so much media time and attention on kind of the gaps that favored Hillary Clinton, and just a lack of appreciation for how Donald Trump was connecting with the rest of the country. Connections that we learned last night in the exit polls that really overrode the disquiet that people had with Donald Trump's personal behavior. People were willing to look past mm-hmm. his comments about women,
right.
his comments about Muslims, and say, yeah, I don't really agree with that. But these other issues I really care much more strongly about.
Well, so you're talking about all the division that we're experiencing by age, race, gender, ethnicity. How will all of these divides impact policymaking, do you think?
Well, I think it's going to be something that's with us for decades and decades. And I don't think it goes away. I think it's something that's managed. If it's managed competently, it won't derail our political process. But frankly, just having observed the Capitol here in St. Paul and Washington, D.C., what I'm seeing is that the politics of division dominates. We've seen in Minnesota just over the last few governing cycles, government shutdown, near government shutdown, failure to pass a bonding bill, which never really happens. I think the stalemate on health reform is another sad example of the inability of legislators to disagree but still find a compromise. Compromise now is equated with betrayal. Last year I had a program with one of the leaders of the Libertarian Party here and a prominent Republican. And the comment of the Libertarian was, the problem with the Republican Party is they sit down at the table to bargain, they get a deal, and government grows. And that's not a bargain that this Libertarian was willing to accept.
Right.
There are a lot of conservative Republicans who have that perspective, and then there are quite liberal folks who are unwilling to entertain the idea of compromising on views they have. For instance, MinCare, which is an important program. It's geared to those kind of just above the poverty line. And one of the proposals to strengthen MinSure is to merge those two programs, or look for ways to better coordinate them.
Yep, I've heard that.
Well, for some liberals, that is just betrayal. They're not willing to even entertain possibilities that would allow MinSure to become more stable and more helpful to more Minnesotans. So there is this kind of a line in the sand that I'm not going to cross that. And that makes it very hard to bridge these divides that are part of our life and I think will deepen in the coming years.
One last question. We've had two recent presidential elections now where one candidate has won the popular vote and the other candidate has won the Electoral College. What about that Electoral College? So our forefathers created it? Has its time passed?
This is one of those kind of adult conversations because there's something that's deeply unsettling about a president being elected who loses the popular vote. And when you explain this to folks from other countries, particularly in Western Europe, they just don't get it because the popular vote there really matters. The bottom line is the barriers to constitutional change are so high and so difficult. Plus, politicians in Minnesota and other medium to small size states think the Electoral College vote actually amplifies their political power. It gives a reason for Donald Trump to pay attention to Minnesota in the closing days, whereas getting a few million votes might not do it, but those 10 Electoral College votes, he does not win without them.
Right. Dr. Jacobs, we have to stop today, but thank you so much for coming.
Good to be with you.